Is the world becoming more violent? Here at Blindsided Scholar, let's take a look at history and see how mankind is doing.
As you watch the news, it can seem like there's an endless amount of violence going on in the world, especially with the recent coverage of mass shootings in the United States. I know many individuals who just choose not to watch the news because it is so depressing. I get that, especially if you include international news. There always seems to be reports of wars, genocide, child slavery, you name it. I've had many conversations where someone states something to the effect of, "The world is just becoming so violent." So that is today's question. Is the world really more violent today than it was in the past? To get started, let's think about the past. Maybe you conjured up images of the 1950s where everyone lived in a house surrounded by a white picket fence. The kids played in the street without any supervision, and all the neighbors watched out for each other. At least that is how it was portrayed in the movies. For this video, I want to start much further back to when we lived as tribes, as hunter-gatherers, or in the early farming villages. You might think that they had an idyllic lifestyle. Sure, they had to fight for food each day, but they had no concerns about warlords or fighting large battles or nuclear weapons. All true, but let's think about it a bit longer. Most likely the tribe was within walking distance of another tribe as shown in this little map. Getting enough food was always a major concern and a struggle, so keeping neighbors out of your territory could be a matter of life and death, as they could deplete your food stock. When winter came, the last thing you would want to find out is that the game is so scarce because of overhunting that you can't get enough food for the winter. When intruders were found in your land, you attacked immediately. If not, they would continue to come back and take advantage of your hospitality. Tribes went to great effort to ensure that they were not seen as being weak by their neighboring tribes. Being seen as weak only invited more and more attacks. This concept is well observed in our prison system. When a new prisoner shows up, the prison yard bullies will come and probe him. If the new prisoner fails to fight back or has no group of friends to protect them, everyone sees them as weak and will take advantage of the new prisoner. The abuse can become quite serious. So as strange it may seem, the new prisoner has to respond to minor bullying vigorously. If a prisoner gets a reputation that they're a hothead, then everyone tends to leave them alone. Now back to our tribes. The reputation of being seen as a strong tribe was in their mind critical to minimizing conflict. This type of thinking is sometimes referred to as honor societies, where the reputation of individuals or tribes is fiercely defended. Unfortunately, this tends to escalate into endless tribal warfare, each feeling like they have to retaliate for any slight to avoid looking weak. I don't want to give the impression they fought battles nonstop. In fact, evidence suggests they only fought on the order of a half a dozen skirmishes each year, which resulted in a handful of tribesmen dying each year, and that doesn't sound all that bad, which is a little deceptive. Let's take a quick look at this chart. It indicates what percentage of a tribe or country is directly involved in warfare. For a tribe, this includes every able-bodied man and teenager. In many cases, the women are directly involved as well. So basically, it was a tribal effort. For modern-day Western countries, it is usually far less than 1% who are directly involved in warfare. In tribal warfare, these small skirmishes were constantly killing off members. So over time, 60% of a tribe would die from these conflicts. That would be equivalent to about 3.2 million Americans dying each year. To put that in perspective, if we add up all the casualties from all the wars fought by the United States, it would amount to 1.3 million, which is far less than the 3.2 million that would die each year. For these tribes, it was a war of attrition. If a tribe ever lost too many members, a neighboring tribe would attack and wipe them out. This type of war is known as endemic warfare. You might be thinking, oh, I just wouldn't get caught up in the whole cycle and let things go. I'm sure there were occasional tribes like that, and my guess they were promptly wiped out. It wasn't an ethics decision. It was a decision about survival. So you might be thinking, how was this endless cycle of tribal warfare broken? It wasn't really. The situation shifted and the technology improved. Essentially, men began to specialize. Individuals would specialize in hunting, farming, cooking, pottery, or in many other skills. This allowed tribes to grow into ever larger groups. Now small kingdoms or fiefdoms started forming. They still compete against their neighboring kingdoms, but the scale changes. At this scale, specialization kicks in. There are dedicated men who are full-time trained soldiers. This means most people never have to deal with going to war. They can focus solely on their own trade or craft. Now in these kingdoms, a king is motivated to keep the peace. Internal fighting leads to a weak kingdom. When strife arises, which it will, a king will mediate the conflict. The king will decree a judgment. The victim gets justice and no longer feels the need for revenge, and the guilty party can take the punishment without the worry he will look weak if he doesn't strike back. This third-party mediation broke the endless tribal warfare, at least within the kingdom. Unfortunately, the kingdoms are still playing out the whole tribal warfare game, just at a larger scale. Each kingdom is trying to avoid looking weak by striking back at any slight. However, because the scale has increased, the battles change. These are no longer small skirmishes, but full-scale battles. These battles require major resources and planning. There were huge drains on the economy and damaged infrastructure. So kings were more reluctant to go into battle and sought out more creative ways to assert their strength without triggering out a full-scale war. In the case a kingdom needed access to resources of a neighboring kingdom, they could either go out to war or hash out a trade agreement. Kings quickly realized that in most cases, a trade agreement was less costly than war. This led to even more specialization and efficiencies, which is more stable. I know what you're probably thinking. Yes, there were less battles, but the battles were bigger. Lots and lots of people died. Yeah, the battles resulted in more dead bodies. But let's go back and look at some numbers. The current U.S. military has around 1.4 million active members. That is less than 0.5% of the U.S. population. The worst war in U.S. history, the Civil War, resulted in about 620,000 casualties, which was around 2% of the U.S. population. Even if the entire U.S. military was wiped out this instant, it would represent a tiny fraction of the population of the U.S. This can be counterintuitive, so let's see if some visualizations help. A red circle represents a tribe at war. Remember, in tribal warfare, almost everyone is involved, which is why the circle is shaded red. A black circle represents a tribe with no current skirmishes. When you zoom out and see all these tribes all constantly fighting these small skirmishes, the entire continent looks like a bloodbath, which it was. Okay, let's redraw the continent with large fictional countries. In a worst-case scenario where most countries are at war, the battles are limited to an area around the borders. Only those in the military, which is a tiny fraction of the population, are actually fighting. The general population may donate food and have higher taxes, but bands of men aren't running through the town slaughtering everyone. Unless a country collapses, the vast majority of people feel little impact on their daily lives. Even when a country is taken over, life is hard usually due to economic hardship, not because the military begins to wipe out the general population and steal the women. With tribal warfare, almost everyone is directly involved in war their entire lives. Okay, violence from wars is better than tribal warfare. Let's move on. Remember how I mentioned that kingdoms were motivated to keep the peace internally? They used rules and judges to keep the peace. They encouraged people to comply by decreeing punishments. There was no form of mass media, so they used the public town squares to punish people so everyone would know about it and be motivated to comply. If crime started to go up, the solution seemed obvious: increase the harshness of the punishments. This got the creative juices flowing. All sorts of harsh capital punishments were invented. In medieval times, they burned people alive, tore them apart, boiled them alive in oil, filleted them alive, and many other methods too gruesome to mention. This somewhat backfired because watching criminal executions became a main attraction during town festivals. If a village didn't have someone to execute for their town festival, they would buy a criminal from the neighboring town. I just can't imagine telling my kid to hurry up or they will miss this year's execution, or complaining because you didn't get a view of the disembowelment. In general, society had a high tolerance for pain and suffering. Death was a common part of life. Just by reading the old war poems and looking at the paintings like this one, you soon realize they glorify torturing people and raping women. They described killing men and women and children in gory detail. They spoke as if it was the highest act of love for your country is to go and torture and disembowel your enemies. So what broke this affinity people had for bloodshed? The answer might surprise you. It certainly surprised me. It was the printing press. Yeah, the printing press. So let's talk about how the printing press changed people's bloodlust. The concept can be captured by the phrase, to walk a mile in their shoes. Think of some of the recent books or movies you enjoyed. Did the plotline include a character that is going up against society in some way? The character is oppressed or misunderstood at no fault of their own. Then the character rises to overcome the challenge and become the hero. We connect with the character, feel the character's pain and struggles. Our emotions soar when the character triumphs. We're drawn to books about underdogs and we empathize with them. Before the printing press, books were rare and only for the wealthy. They mostly focused on things like historical records, poems, and religious texts. The printing press changed all that. Books became cheaper and a new genre of fiction sprang up. Reading for pleasure was an entirely new concept. Stories such as Oliver Twist, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Crime and Punishment, Les Miserables, and many more. These books had an impact on society. People began to empathize with the downtrodden and the oppressed. When watching someone being tortured to death at the Spring Festival, maybe you began to think, maybe he only stole a piece of bread because his family was starving. Maybe he was falsely accused for political motives. How was their family going to survive without the mother or father? There were no safety nets back then, so watching executions became less appealing. Modern-day films have a similar impact on us as well. I'm not talking just about serious documentaries. Popular films like 12 Years a Slave, Pursuit of Happiness, and Slumdog Millionaire, and even TV series like Star Trek all tell stories of underdogs and evoke strong feelings towards the less fortunate. Sometimes it can be hard to believe that before the printing press there was generally a lack of empathy for the less fortunate. I suggest reading about a North Korean prisoner who escaped from a labor camp in a book called Escape from Camp 14. He represents the mindset of someone who has struggled his whole life and had no empathy for anyone or from anyone, including his own family. And just like the medieval times, he was forced to watch executions regularly and had no feeling of sorrow for those being killed. He simply figured they got what they deserved. Let's talk about factors after the printing press that contributed to a less violent world. There are several factors, but three major factors are democracy, economic interdependence or globalism, and free speech and freedom of the press. First, democracy. Studies show that true democratic countries are less likely to go to war, and in war, seek ways to end it more quickly. Second, economic interdependence. This is an outgrowth of a global economy. For example, the electronics industry has almost completely moved to Asia. The U.S. relies on imports for many things that they no longer produce. A war between the U.S. and China would cripple both economies. So despite lots of disagreements, such as Taiwan, DPRK, and South China Sea disputes, it is unlikely that China and the U.S. will go to war. Third is freedom of speech. This needs little explanation, but studies show that countries with strong protections for freedom of speech have less corruption and commit far less violent atrocities. All three of these factors work together to reduce violence around the world. Recently, mankind has made dramatic progress in reducing violence. It took thousands of years just to get to the printing press, but now things are improving faster than ever before. At times, it feels like things are improving so slowly. But let's think about some of the more recent improvements. Not too long ago, the mentally ill used to be cast off or sent to institutions that often abused and tortured them horribly. Spousal and child abuse used to be considered a family affair that was none of the public's business. Men had complete protection under the law to rape their wife. Several decades ago, a father could severely beat his child without fear of punishment. Now society questions if spanking is acceptable. We now rightfully condemn any man or woman for abusing their significant other, including emotional abuse. Slavery used to be condoned by the U.S. government. After slavery ended, there were still mob hangings. Segregation and discrimination were state-sponsored. Now, don't get me wrong, we are still struggling with racial injustices today, but it is a far cry from what it used to be. During the industrial era, nothing much was thought of having children do life-threatening jobs in factories. children are regularly killed and there was no public outcry. Factory owners simply went to the streets looking for more poor children to replace those who died. There are too many ways violence has been reduced. There's no way I could list them all. As a society, we still struggle with all of those issues I just mentioned. However, the issues surrounding those problems have been dramatically reduced in the last 100 or so years. With 7.6 billion people on the earth, there will always be some kind of violence. Societies used to only hear about the violence in their own neighborhood. Now news organizations are constantly collating all the violent events around the world and giving it to us in constant doses. It feels like the world is awash in violence. If someone had an easy button that would reduce all the violent crime by 90%, there would still be plenty of violence for the news organizations to collate and give it to us in a 24/7 news feed as they do now. Am I suggesting we can ignore issues concerning violence? Of course not. In fact, I made this video with the idea to instill hope that things do and are getting better for those social justice warriors who are fighting to end child sex slavery, hate crimes, spousal and child abuse, homicides, and many other just causes. I implore you to keep going and keep fighting. I want to make sure you know that your effort matters and is making a difference. Things are probably not improving as fast as you would like, but they are improving. In fact, improving faster than it ever has in the history of humankind, thanks to people like you. In conclusion, I made a case to show that despite how you feel after watching the news, the world is dramatically less violent than it used to be. In fact, mankind has never experienced the level of peace we enjoy in the world today. Are there more factors to the reduction in violence than I discussed in this video? Of course. History is always way more complicated than what can be discussed in a short video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I suggest reading The Better Angels of Our Nature and The Progress Paradox. Thank you for watching my first video. If you found the video interesting and would like to support more videos, please consider clicking here to subscribe. I look forward to reading your comments and suggestions below. With that, I'll sign off by saying to remember to be kind, keep learning, and to look for those opportunities you can change the world for the better. Thank you for watching The Blindsided Scholar.